Okay. So, dear delegates, good morning and thank you so much for attending our webcast today. My name is Alice Ervat and I'm the Head of External Relations for GMUN 2020. Some of you may already be acquainted with me, as I had the responsibility and the honor of organizing and hosting some of the pre-conference events, which I hope you thoroughly enjoyed. It is with great enthusiasm that I welcome you to the day 2 of the Global Model United Nations 2020. I hope that you are well rested, as today we will have another eventful day, packed with debates and resolution writing. But before starting with the deliberation sessions, I would like to introduce the discussion for today's webcast. For those of you who are following us on YouTube, be advised that you have the possibility to submit your questions for the final Q&A through Instagram, right into our official page, or by sending an email to globalmoon20@gmail.com. I will now proceed to introduce the topic of today's webcast, which is green diplomacy. Green diplomacy can be defined as diplomacy that seeks to harmonize the interests of a state along with the interests of every human being on the planet concerning the conservation and development of natural conditions of life. The guest speaker tackling this topic today will be Professor Aldo Ravazzi. Aldo Ravazzi is an economist. His professional life in Italy and internationally is focused on environment, energy, and sustainable development. In Italy, notably at the Ministry of Environment, Land and Sea, and at IRI, he has been working on environment, public finance, and regional policies. At the international level, he is co-president of OECD committees on biodiversity, water and ecosystems since 2010, and on environmental performance country reviews since 2012. Previously, he has been chairing the OECD committees on the integration of economic and environmental policies and on environmental taxation. He is a member of the major European and international networks on the economic instruments for environmental policy, environmentally harmful subsidies, and green tax reforms at EEA, European Commission, MBI Forum, GCT, Green Budget Europe, where he is vice president. He has advised several governments in the frame of OECD environmental reviews and has been project leader for the UE Morocco twinning on environmentally integrated management. He is or has been advisor for several European research projects on environmental policy, resources and indicators, such as GRDP, InStream, Dynamics, and Cecilia 2050. He is a member of the scientific committees of AAA, Environmental Analysts Associations, Rientro Dolce, Demography and the Environment, Foundation Centro Futuro Sostenibile, and he also collaborates with Ambiente Italia, Foundation Sustainable Development, UN Med SDSN Center. He has participated in numerous conferences and publications related to environmental and sustainable development, for instance, Rio Plus 20 and World Water Forum in Marseille 2012. He has organized several international conferences, for instance, the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists in 2011, and the International Conference on Fiscal Federalism and Environmental Fiscality. Professor Ravazzi has also studied at the University of Roma 1, so Sapienza University, at the University of York. He teaches environmental economics at the University of Roma 2 Tor Vergata and sustainable development at the University of Roma Luis. Professor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alice. This reminds me that I'm getting old. I've tried to do a number of things in my professional life. I'm loading my presentation to help communication. And this, I think, it's useful when we are working in an international forum and I speak an Italian English. So the slides will help me to communicate what I try to say. Can you see the slide on the screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I understand we have friends and colleagues and researchers connected from many parts of the planet. So let me say welcome to Rome. Most of us are still locked in our houses, flats, or in our offices. So it would be much nicer to be all together here in Rome today, but we are lucky that we have this great improvement in technology and we can connect through the international Zoom and other kinds of international connection. Welcome to Rome means the history of the Colosseum of the ancient Romans, but also the Baroque and Renaissance of Piazza Navona, or among the recent buildings, the auditorium by architect Renzo Piano, and we missed the concerts in summer, I must say. And bottom down is the Appia Antica, the old Roman way, filled with bicycles coming back as a sustainable mode of transport, which might help us. Even if I'm not a true Catholic, I think it's good also to remind that here in Rome is the Papa Francesco, Pope Francis, with his encyclica Laudato Si, has given an important contribution to environmental policy, to sustainable development, and to green diplomacy. Because in the text by Pope Francis, we can find most of the most important findings and contribution of the green community, of the environment experts community, to the global reflection. And these are things we can keep in mind when we try to work in green diplomacy. Uh, when we try to organize ourselves, all the countries together, to work together to promote a better planet, we have to keep in mind a number of milestones that we have behind us on which we can build upon and go ahead. And it's not for personal interest as an ancient Roman, but I remind to those who have never met these kind of studies to go back to the report of the MIT in 72 for the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth. We had the possibility to celebrate a couple of years ago the 50 years of the Club of Rome. This remains really a key report which helps us to understand that we should grow, we can continue to grow, but we must find ways to grow in a way which do not go beyond the limits, beyond the capacities of the planet. And there is no green diplomacy, there is no diplomacy at all if we do not conserve the capacity of the planet to sustain us, and we don't have the planet to support us. A key element that we need to keep in mind is coming from the scientific community by the Geologist World Association, which is suggesting that we have entered into a new geological era, a new geological epoch. After the Holocene, we are coming out of Holocene and we are entering in something that we may call Anthropocene. So with anthropos, the humans at the center of the capacity of changing the crust of the planet, the fact that humans in the last, say, 50 years have been able to change biological cycles, the ways in which we produce, in which we consume, in which we live and we organize ourselves, are really changing the geological nature of the planet. And so we have to pay attention to do it in a proper way. To be based on available science, this is a key concept for green diplomats, but I would say again for diplomats in general. The contribution which I would quote as the most important, resuming the situation, is that of the scientists around the Johan Rockström. They launched in 2009 on the review Nature an analysis of a planet ecosystem to be kept under control. And in their analysis, they're suggesting to us that there are three ecosystems which are already in trouble, and they are the well-known climate change effect, the little less known biodiversity problem. We are losing biodiversity, and the nitrogen cycle, which is so key in the agriculture and food production. But we also have a number of other ecosystems that we should keep under control. They go from the phosphorus cycle, still important in agriculture, to the stratospheric ozone depletion, to the ocean acidification process, to the chemical pollution, to the land system change, and the atmospheric aerosol loading and chemical pollution, which needs to be still researched and understood correctly and measured. These are all ecosystems that the planet is giving to us, human society, and that we must be able to conserve, keep, and possibly enrich. There are also more recent versions of this research by Rockstrom and the others that we can find in literature. I think that a good green diplomat should keep in mind the basis for economics relationship with nature. This means the work by Wickman and Röckström, bankrupting nature, denying our planetary boundaries, where they defend the idea that we have to save our planet, which means saving the human species, first of all, from our point of view. We can study, we have done fantastic advancement. We must continue to research and understand how the planet works, and we must respect these planetary boundaries. But from those who have studies in economics or planning to study political sciences, international relations, I would suggest to keep an eye on the economics aspects. And for this, three are the major references. One is the Economics of Climate Change, otherwise called the Stern Review, from the name of Nicholas Stern, former chief economist at the Bank of England, probably the first traditional economist trying to put figures and evaluation on climate change and its impact, telling us that it is better to spend 100, whatever, euro, dollars, renminbi today, because if we wait for the impact of climate change, we risk to pay 1 million or 1 billion dollars, euro, or renminbi in 20 or 50 years. Second major reference is the TEEB report, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, led by the Indian economist Pavan Sukhdev, who has been an economist with Deutsche Bank first, and then has led this work of the major international organizations working on economics and biodiversity, UNEP, OECD, and so on. And the third major reference for me is the Factor 5 report, prepared by Ernst von Weizsäcker, who is a German researcher who has founded the Wuppertal Institute on Ecology, Economics, and Energy, who has funded the IEP, the Institute of European Environmental Studies, who has been a director for science at United Nations in New York. So again, as you see, an attempt to put together economic analysis, environmental research, and policy approach in a frame of international cooperation. But what must be clear, I think, from this point of view, is the traditional relation between the economic system and the environmental system. And here, traditionally, the approach has been to consider the economic system on the same level as the ecological system, the ecosystem. And in a very simplified model that we can represent here following Herman Daly or Francesco La Camera, for example, the economic system, we have ourselves, consumers, we give production factors, our work, our jobs, our capitals, our loans to firms. They use them, they translate them into goods and services, which are then again sold to consumers. And we must optimize this kind of cycle. On the other side, we have the ecosystem with all the ecosystem functions because they give natural resources that can be used by the economic system. They have a function of deposit. What we do not use today will be available tomorrow, and vice versa. And we have recreational functions of a kind, going to the beach or going in the mountains for a walk for the pleasure. All the functions that the ecosystems gives to humans and their economic system. And the traditional approach has been to say, well, the economic system is taking renewable and non-renewable sources from the ecosystem, it produces, and then it gives back waste, consumption waste and production waste to the ecosystem. We just have to optimize this kind of flows, this kind of relations. In fact, if we think about these things, we will reach the conclusion that the economic system is inside the ecosystem. We don't have a balance among the two. We are not on the same order of magnitude and relevance. The economic system has its own important rules, but it has to respect the limits of the planets. There is really a change of paradigm that we have to keep in mind at all levels, including when we work at international level in the United Nations world, in diplomacy, in international relations, in the international agreements. And what we have seen in the last decades is that the economic system is growing and growing and growing and touching the limits and sometimes overpassing the thresholds of the planet, of its capacity to give us the natural resources that we need. This is why, at the United Nations level, we have been able to develop a common framework finally. We call it the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030 agreement signed in New York in 2015. And I suppose and hope that most of those who are connected today have been through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which have elements of economic traditional approach, elements of social analysis, and elements of environmental analysis, together with what they're called traditionally the three pillars of sustainable development. But there is also a fourth dimension, that of governance, and global governance is particularly near to the heart of many of us. The fourth pillar of governance. We need a global governance. We need to work together to advance on all of these aspects. We cannot focus only on the economic dimension of the development of our societies, of our economies. We must pay attention to the planet, but at the same time to people. We must pay attention and prepare prosperity for all and not leave behind anybody. We must try to build peace and partnership among the different stakeholders that we have in mind. The contribution of environmental sensitivity to the global dimension comes from a number of authors in the past. But before going to that, I would like to propose you two interpretations of the Sustainable Development Goals. On the left of this slide, you can see the Stockholm Resilience Center, which has reorganized the 17 development goals, giving this idea that at the bottom, the base is to protect and enrich possibly the biosphere with the elements about climate, biodiversity, marine and terrestrial biodiversity, of sustainable consumption and production. Then we move to the society with all the social aspect about no poverty, no hunger, and so on. And then finally, the economy can work if the biosphere level and the society level work, and we can try to maximize our production and wealth within the limits, respecting the planetary boundaries. On the right, we have a contribution of the European Union, the European Commission, who has prepared this report on biodiversity and the links between science, the ecosystems, the regulating, provisioning, cultural, and supporting functions of the ecosystems, how biodiversity is at the roots of all of this. And I think that without these minimum elements of knowledge, it becomes extremely difficult to work for international diplomacy and green diplomacy in particular. I was making reference to some of the historical people who have helped to increase this environmental ecological awareness at global level, from Rachel Carson in Silent Spring in USA, when she realized that a number of insects and species were disappearing because of the agricultural activity, of the impact of human activity, to Closing Circle by Barry Commoner, one of the first to analyze the impact of our energy production system, to Small is Beautiful, the idea by the economist Schumacher that not necessarily we need to build big plants, big infrastructure, but not always, but in many cases, we can try to have a small dimension, which is more manageable, it's more widespread through the population, through the territories, and helps to reach the ecological dimension. I mentioned the limits to growth by the Club of Rome, by the MIT first report. By the way, the Planetary Boundaries report that I quoted earlier is also a report to the Club of Rome. Club of Rome was organized, coordinated by an Italian business manager, Aurelio Peccei of the Fiat Group, and by Alexander King of the OECD. And still today, they put together a number of researchers and policy people who are trying to push for the sustainability of the management of the planet. I will not go into the details of the report of the Club of Rome, but it was certainly a foreplanner looking forward in a excellent optimizing approach to understand what the true problems were. Most of us know the Brundtland report in '87, coming from the World Commission of the United Nations on Environment and Development. Ms. Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway, she came to the Commission in order to prepare the analysis supporting what all the agreements at international level would be on sustainable development, and the famous definition of sustainable development that meets the needs of the present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs comes from this report. Now, we all know that the definitions of sustainable development have multiplied. We have different nuances and approaches. All of us have met ideas of growth, of development, which is more qualitative. At United Nations, the common language is to talk about sustainable development, putting economic, social, and environmental aspects together. The francophones in France or in Canada are proposing développement durable, durable development. At OECD, where economy is the center, often we prefer to talk about green growth, so the green elements of growth. Green economy, it's called at UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program Agency. Sometimes in Britain you find sustainable economy, which we should not be confused with assisted economy, which is at the center of a British debate. Sustainable prosperity is a is a way to define these kind of matters of sustainable development in Canada. In UK, again, the Sustainable Development Commission, led by Tim Jackson, has talked about prosperity without growth. And the planetary boundaries, the limits to growth, we have already mentioned. There is an alternative approach which talks about degrowth, possibly happy, possibly smart, referring to Serge Latouche. It's a very different approach, but probably it's important to keep in mind these alternative possibilities. And often we hear about sustained growth in some less developed countries, or at the World Bank. There is an underlining the necessity for many countries still to go for a quantitative growth, but we must find the ways to keep this. Now, what is important, even for green diplomats, is this little idea from economists that GDP is an important tool, but is not explaining everything. As you may remember, GDP was introduced after the 1929 crisis, but even Kuznets, the American economist of Russian origin, who was charged by the American Congress to define GDP with his researchers, had underlined the limits of GDP. GDP is measuring economic activities. It is not sufficient to measure welfare. And the treatment of GDP by economists is sometimes a shortcut, and they try to impose to all the human community that it is the only indicator. Not to mention politicians, not to mention journalists. I repeat, even the founder, the first definers of GDP were not saying that GDP covers all the dimensions of human progress. We need more. We need to integrate environmental and social aspects in welfare. This is why we have developed this framework of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we have to keep it in mind because they are difficult to manage.
I'm sorry, Professor. Sorry to interrupt you, but as I see, we are just joined by Ms. Sara Savastano. I'm sure Ms. Savastano would like to make to say a few words.
I'll go rapidly to a conclusion.
No, Ms. Savastano, I think would just like to.
Let Aldo finish his introduction, and then I just wanted to, I'm going to be connected as much as I can. I just wanted to say hi and thank Aldo for joining and for presenting today. Please continue, Aldo.
Thank you very much to Ms. Savastano. I will go ahead reminding us with Sustainable Development Goals, which are a way to try to have a holistic approach, a complete approach, with all the elements about economic, social, and environmental aspects, which are now our common framework for all the nations, all the countries of the planet. And it is in this framework that we have um, agreed at international level a number of important agreements which have been growing and more important in the planetary framework. We started with the UN Stockholm Conference on Human Environment. We mentioned the Brundtland Commission in the 80s. This led to the most important Rio Conference on Environment and Development, the so-called Earth Summit in '92, with its Agenda 21 and its major international multilateral agreements on environment. '97, the Kyoto Protocol, most of us remember it. The Millennium Development Goals, which are a sort of precursor of Sustainable Development Goals, were launched in the year 2000. In Johannesburg 2002, it was a sort of Rio plus 10, the UN Summit on Sustainable Development. And in Rio, we came back in 2012 and tried to advance things, which led to these Agenda 2030 approved in 2015 in New York with the Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, the other central firelight is the Paris Agreement, which has made a general agreement to not rise the global temperature by more than 2 degrees, possibly 1 degree, 0.5, compared to the pre-industrial era because of green gas emissions. And we need to keep this in mind because it has become really the center of international diplomacy. It is entering into the European Union Green Deal agreements. It is part of the COVID-19 crisis catching up, and countries are approaching this in very different ways. Some countries, some experts are still opposing that, but I'm afraid that the science and the evidence of true serious research is showing us and demonstrating that we have a problem with climate and we have to deal with it. Another dimension which is sometimes not known sufficiently is that of the efficiency of resources, the need to approach on the quantity of resources that we use, and that we can improve through technological innovation, through regulation, through economic instruments. Janez Potočnik has been a European Union commissioner. He's leading the International Resources Panel, and he has made a nice summary saying that for the first time in human history, we are facing the emergence of a single, tightly coupled human social ecological system of planetary scope. We are more interconnected and interdependent. We have an individual and collective responsibility which has enormously increased. And we can adopt a number of measures at national level, but if we adopt them, discuss, agree in an international framework, obviously we will be much stronger in dealing with the problems that we have in front of us. I mentioned factor 4. I will leave this, I think the presentation will be available for those who wish to consult it. I want to mention the work by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation trying to build what is an approach to circular economy. This is another concept which is becoming more and more important and might help us in our international activities, diplomatic negotiations, and so on. We are trying to minimize the production of waste. We are trying to maximize reuse, recycling, remanufacturing. We must find ways to better use our resources in a more efficient way. And the concept of decoupling is key and related to this. It has well been developed by Paul Eakins from University College London, leading the researchers of UNEP, of UN Environment, the idea that economic activity can continue to increase, but we have to reach relative decoupling, so the increase in the use of resources must be lower than the increase in economic activity. Possibly it must be an absolute decoupling, so that the resource use decrease while the economic activity increases. And certainly the final environmental impact must radically decrease if we want to have a planet which is available for us humans, because while we increase economic activity, while we reduce resource use and environmental impact, we are improving human well-being, which is one of our most important priority. I will go rapidly to final consideration. This is my last slide. In '92, we had in the Rio United Nations Earth Summit the elaboration and signing of 3 major international multilateral conventions in environment. The climate, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UNCCD, the United Nations Conventions Combating Desertification. From this, we have developed the Kyoto Protocol in the frame of the Climate Convention, as well as the Paris Agreement in 2015. You know that the COP, the Conference of the Parties, is organized by UK with the support of Italy this year. Because of the COVID crisis, we will probably shift most of the activities to 21. At the same time, on the Biodiversity Convention, we have the update of the global strategy of 2010. We are preparing the new strategy for 2020. We have to verify the achievement of the Aichi targets 2010, decided in Japan. The COP, the Conference of Parties, is expected in China this year, and again, because of COVID-19, parts of it shifts to 2021. But there are more than 200 international conventions in the environmental area, from the ozone Montreal layer to the Convention to the Access to Environmental Democracy and Justice, to the Convention on Mercury, and so on. So there's a lot of work in the environmental field, in the sustainable development field, that we have to follow to prepare. We must give science and economics knowledge to make them more efficient and more forward-looking. We have finally this general framework, which is accepted by all countries, the UN 2030 Agenda and the 17 SDGs. We really need diplomats with scientific knowledge and economic knowledge. And this means that in our studies, in our research, we must be able to develop scientific advancement and economic instruments which serve the global community. And we need scientists and economists who become diplomats in order to have a scientific, sound-based green diplomacy. With this, I thank you for your attention, and I give back the floor to our organizers.
Thank you so much, Professor Ravazzi, for your presentation. It was really enlightening, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of the whole audience of delegates with these words. And thank you so much also for being really on time. This leaves us around 25 minutes to open the floor for questions. And I must really say that I have to thank you guys, because the response that you are having are amazing. A lot of questions coming in, rolling in, and I'm really excited to start the debate now. So if you allow me the license, I would like to queue up my questions as I have been thinking about this all night long, because I was really excited about this topic. And so, given that you have mentioned Mr. Francesco La Camera, who is currently the director of IRENA in Abu Dhabi, I wanted to ask you that given that according to the EEI, the Global Energy Association, investment in 2020 in energy have dropped by 20%. So do you think that COVID-19, this crisis given by COVID-19, has accelerated or braked the transition towards renewable energy?
That's an interesting issue. IRENA, or IRENA as you call it, and most people call it, But I say Italy. What do you say? Italy. I would say Italy, and so Irena. Anyway, they're doing a great job because they are working for promoting renewable energies and energy efficiency. And they have prepared this year a couple of reports which are really key to for all those who are studying international relations and environment and sustainable development. The investment have gone down, yes, because of the COVID crisis also, but the general trend in the last years has been of a growing investments in renewables, and they have overcome traditional investment in fossil fuels and nuclear energy. The production of electricity in most of our countries is now coming as a majority from renewables. The costs of production have decreased so much because of scale economies and scope economies that we can rely on renewables for not all the needs that we have in electricity, but for a certain number. Obviously, we know the need of the grids, of the networks to guarantee supply all over the day and all over the seasons and the year. So there's a number of things that we have to keep under control. But the role of renewables has increased, is increasing, and will increase even more. The crisis obviously is influencing all of us. Some of our countries, I'm thinking mainly to European Union and their countries, had adopted at the end of last year the so-called New Deal, Green Deal, remembering the American Roosevelt's New Deal, which has at the center climate change, environmental policy, sustainable development. Will it resist to the trauma, to the shocks of the COVID? I hope so, and we're all working for defending these elements and to keep them at the center. If we relaunch the economy following the traditional approaches based on quantitative use, exploitation of natural resources, we will be in trouble again in some form. We don't know, even if we have some suspicion that the COVID development is also related to a not wise management of natural resources, the relationship between animals and humans. But certainly, this is another opportunity which is offered to us to think about what is really sustainable and what is not. So we all have to work in research, in our studies, in government, in businesses and firms on how we can advance and choose models of consumption and production which fit to the planet and that we're able to organize. This is the good news. We can do it.
Amazing. I think that we have discussed something similar during our pre-conference event about the impact of COVID with Mr. Ergin Erdem, talking about the Building Back Better concept that the United Nations Development Program keeps pushing. And I do really think that this crisis will be an amazing opportunity to accelerate the transition towards renewable energies. So I'm going to unite some questions because they are pretty similar. But what we would really like to know also with our head of logistics, Ingrid, she has asked, how do you think that COVID will change the green diplomacy, either for the better or for the worse? And let me add, like, what do you think the limitations of green diplomacy, either for the better or for the worse? And let me add,
Alice, if you were asking to me, I've lost the connection, the sound. Could you repeat the?
yes, of course. Our head of logistics, Ingrid, has asked, how do you think that COVID-19 will actually change green diplomacy, either for the better or for the worse? And let me add, like, what do you think the limitations of green diplomacy currently are?
I don't know how COVID will change things. We are all, I think, in a great uncertainty. I know most students around the world are having their exams and tests and graduations by internet connection, which is a strange situation, and I am very, we must express solidarity to all of you and to all of us teachers trying to help. In policy, it is the same. I can see that all the stakeholders are trying to renew their priorities and commitments and to adapt them to COVID. This is true for public administrations, for public agencies, for international organizations. It is true for businesses. advanced green sectors and old traditional brown sectors. Everybody is trying to maximize the profits, the revenue from the situation. So we had reached a number of agreements like the Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement, the Biodiversity Global Convention, the Green Deal in European Union. I think we must try to defend them and to show that these are the answers that may avoid to come back to other COVID crises, not the same COVID crisis necessarily, but other kinds of collapses, of non-return points that sometimes we have these tipping points that we talk about when we talk of sustainable development. If we do not adopt measures which help us. So it's a continuous debate and it's a continued defense, I think. But we have good arguments to share with our communities. So I think we are in a good position from this point of view. And international diplomacy will be influenced in a way that we have to work more together. I think we will have an encouragement to work together. Some countries want to close themselves to the external world. It doesn't work. We have seen that it doesn't work. You cannot control all the movements of people, of goods. So if we do not go for more cooperation, more efficient cooperation, we will not solve the problem.
Amazing. So, given that you have mentioned the European Union, I wanted to ask you some questions are coming in regarding this. Does the EU have a unified stance on green diplomacy?
We don't have a unified stance on diplomacy in general, but certainly the European Union, thanks to a great work from colleagues of the European Commission, I must say, European Commission is often criticized to be too much bureaucratic, too much concentrated on their own interest. I don't think this is true in general, and particularly this is not true in environment and sustainable development. We have good positive colleagues. So for Europeans at least, this is a place to work because there is a great preparation and a great attention. The European Union is often one of the leaders in international negotiations on climate and biodiversity, on mercury. We have seen this in the past, and it helps also some of the European countries who are a little bit sleepy on these topics to go ahead. I must say Italy, for example, has benefited from European Union environmental policies. They helped us to advance very much. And this is true for many of the new countries who have entered the European Union very welcome in the last years.
Very, very well. And now we have some other questions from our Italian colleagues that have been quite interested in the statistical part, let's say accounting part, which we are an expert on. And the question is, what is the role of green diplomacy in creating a global accounting infrastructure and a so-called balance sheet for the planet?
Well, there is a great work in the frame of United Nations, in the United Nations Statistics Department, supporting what is called the UNCEA, the System of Integrated Economic and Environmental Accounting. Thanks to the statistical community, to the statisticians, we are developing common frameworks for measuring environmental dimensions, which may go from environmental expenditure in public budgets to the relevance of taxes with an environmental impact, to the emissions which are changing the climate, contributing to global warming, to a number of elements which on energy, for example, which is key obviously in environmental policy and help us. I would say this is a very special form of green diplomacy because really it is based on science, on research, on statistical capacity, and so on. But certainly, without the work of these UNSCA and the community of statisticians, we would not be in conditions to measure or to try to measure the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which many will remember have behind something like 159 targets, quantitative targets, And behind the targets, we have 230 indicators. So that's a large number. Not in all countries, the 230 indicators are needed. They are available for all countries. But certainly, if we have data, if we can measure phenomena, we will have a reference to which we can measure the capacity of our politicians, of our communities to adopt policies which advance in the right direction. So certainly the community is going forward. There's another dimension of accounting, which is, I think, is very important at international level, not only at national level, is the capacity of reporting on non-financial aspects. Our companies in all the world have traditionally what we call the profit and losses account. They have a capital statement. They have a financial statement. These are the minimum contents for financial reporting. Now, in Europe and in other countries, we are developing non-financial reporting on aspects like environment, starting from climate and biodiversity, natural capital, but also human rights, gender parity, and a number of other elements of social nature. These are, for the moment, practically based on voluntary approach. I think that after 20, 25 years of attempts, it is time to come to a common agreed set of minimum contents also on environmental and social aspects of the activities of our businesses. And we can see many of our businesses in their sustainability report, environmental reports, following the rules by GRI or by the United Nations Global Compact. They have started to make this effort. It is time to come to a common set of rules, I think, agreed at international level altogether.
Thank you. I do believe that this non-financial reporting can add can be incorporated with the GDP reporting, and they can give us a 360 view of the issue worldwide. So I'm actually incorporating this question from our head of communication, Arman, with another similar one. And it's also COVID related because it seems to be quite an interesting topic for us, of course, since most of us are still in lockdown. So considering the recent developments caused by the pandemic, do you think that UN defined sustainable development goals require some restructuring or reinterpreting that should be done soon? And on this question, I want to piggyback and ask you, what do you think that the foremost priority of COP26, which was supposed to be held today, this year, but will be held in the next year, are? What are the priorities?
I'm not sure that we should reinterpret and reread everything through the pandemics in spite of its heavy impact. And I would not forget that we had other forms of epidemic and pandemics around the world, from Ebola in Africa, for example, who have been very, very hard on many communities. The framework of SDGs seems to me with a number of compromises, which is unavoidable when you or in a diplomatic area of 197 countries having to agree something. It's not easy, as we can imagine. So the framework stands. There are elements paying attention to health problem, health system, to the poverty aspects, which might be affected heavily by COVID pandemics and so on. The framework seems to me robust, and we can continue to work and to advance. This, to me, it doesn't seem a major change. I must say I'm not an epidemiologist, and I can see that even epidemiologists have still some elements of uncertainty about the analysis of the situation and the epidemic. On the COP26, it's extremely important to advance in all the negotiations about climate. I must confess, as an economist, obviously I have a bias due to my studies. I'm very happy from a diplomatic point of view that we have been able to find an agreement with all the countries of the planet. I'm a little bit more skeptical because I cannot see in the Paris Agreement so much a role for economic aspects. There is this important financial commitment by developed countries to transfer $100 billion per year to developing countries in order to help them to develop without emitting so much, adopting technologies which are respectful of the planetary boundaries. And this is an important alliance between developing and developed countries. We have a reference to build markets for CO2 emissions because they do not exist naturally. And the USA experience with a number of gases and markets organized in some American states has been the first innovative approach. The European Union has built an ETS, an emission trading scheme, for the 6 gases provoking the climate change, the global warming, and it's a market with 450 million people and more. The Chinese have introduced ETS equivalent markets in 7 of their provinces. Japan has tried, Australia has tried, they've come back. It's not easy to build a market when it doesn't exist. But we don't have specific commitments for the moment in the Paris Agreement. And I'm afraid that we need some price signals, which economists love so much. A carbon price, we have implicitly, sometimes rarely explicitly, probably a carbon tax would help all of our countries to give the right signal on consumption and production, sustainable modes.
For sure. So let me wrap it up with a final question, which is kind of more personal. I'm sure that many young delegates in our audience would like to follow your career path, let's say, and break into the sustainability and economics industry. So what would be your number one advice for these dedicated people that want to work either in UNEP or in any environmental program in the UN?
Well, not to follow me, because, for example, I did not go for what will be my first suggestion, study and research and try to get a PhD. The competition in international organization has become very, very tough to enter in these organizations. And I followed a master in Old York in UK, but I didn't go for the PhD. I came back to work for Italian public enterprises. And this is a problem today. This is a real problem. If you want to work, you need solid scientific basis. I would strongly recommend to go for a scientific degree, physics, chemicals, biology, natural science, and then add on that a master or a PhD in economics or in sustainable development. But if we have started with economics like myself, or political sciences or international relations, we can still do a very good job and a very good profession and career. Let's keep an eye on scientific analysis. So the contributions which I mentioned as an example from Röckström, from the Club of Rome, from von Weizsäcker, are key to understand what is happening. And I would pay also a little attention to economic aspects, because at the end of the day, obviously, prices and markets, if we well use them, can help us to advance even on sustainable development policies. So this would be key for diplomats. Please don't limit yourself to very important analysis and study of historical agreements and building agreements. We need also a scientific and economic background to be more robust and more effective.
Thank you so much. I think this is really pragmatic advice on the steps that we should follow, and I hope any of us could actually make it and break into the industry. And also, I would like to thank you so much for the enlightening discussion on the future of green diplomacy. I'm really sure that our delegates will have the opportunity to discuss this further during negotiations or lobbying if they're interested in. Given the coronavirus pandemics, it is of utmost importance that we keep advocating for a more sustainable future, for sure. So now I will switch back to addressing the delegates. So dear delegates, I would now like to divert your attention towards the agenda of today. Yesterday, you should have received a detailed email explaining the steps to be automatically reassigned to your breakout rooms upon entering. So please do make sure that you have been logging in your Zoom account, so that we will recognize the client and you will be put automatically in the breakout room that you have been assigned to. Please make sure to follow these rules strictly so as to facilitate the GMUN staff work for today. Then we will ask you to join the provided Zoom link at 11:10 sharp. Please remember 11:10, so as to immediately start with the debate. Professor Ravazzi, I would like to thank you again on the behalf of the whole GMUN staff. I think that this has been an amazing opportunity to hear your voice and hopefully to imagine and build a career in your industry. So again, also addressing the delegates, thank you very much for being here and good luck and happy delegating.
Thank you to all of us working for this and on these topics. Thanks to you, President Alice, and to all the organizers. I think it's an important opportunity to stay and reflect together. Best wishes for our studies and careers. Thank you.
Mr. Manetti, is the webcast over?
He said stand by.